I may be too cynical, but one starts to wonder whether the present mainstream debate happens now because it's too late. Or there was a famous headline of the New York Post, "There's no famine in Gaza." And the realities were quite clear. But I don't think that you can hide the realities too long. The reality is that ultimately the real data will come out. If I can make a personal comment, for me personally, and the reason I started writing this first book and then the second one, was that for me it has been a situation where Israel has been sleepwalking into a catastrophe. This is not war. It's mass butchery by any other name, the way I feel about it.
Welcome to the FloodGate Podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. I'm your host for this episode, Robert Inlakesh, and today I'll be speaking to Dr. Dan Steinbock, who is an internationally renowned expert on the multipolar world economy and the author of many books, the latest of which are The Fall of Israel, The Degradation of Israel's Politics, Economy and Military, and The Obliteration Doctrine. Due to the fact that right now, the most pressing topic on everyone's minds is famine that has gripped the Gaza Strip and starvation, I wanted to actually ask you a question about a topic that you touch on, which is this topic, in your book, The Obliteration Doctrine, and that is starvation as a method of war. And you write in the book about the fact that since October 7, in fact, months before October 7, five out of five of Gaza's residents are largely dependent upon humanitarian aid. And this has been a problem in the Gaza Strip, not only in the immediate aftermath of the siege or the tightening of the siege in Gaza, but also prior to that. And I wanted to have you elaborate on that and why that is important, understanding that there is a history of Israel using starvation as a method of war, as you write in your book.
Yes. Thank you, Robert, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor for me as well. Actually, both the fall of Israel and the Obliteration Doctrine talk about the use of starvation in war as a method of war. I have been stunned by what has happened in the past 1 or 2 months, because seriously, this goes way back, as you mentioned. I may be too cynical, but one starts to wonder whether the present mainstream debate happens now because it's too late. It's very convenient. So many people have died in an unwarranted war. But if you look back, why would one conclude this way? Here's my take on it. In 2006, when Hamas won the Palestinian election, meaning the election both in Gaza and the West Bank, Israel and the Middle East Quartet, particularly US, EU, and so on, launched economic sanctions against the Palestinians. The result was a blockade, and the idea was deliberately to push the Gazan economy to the brink of collapse, quote unquote, according to WikiLeaks from the US diplomatic cable. And the Israeli officials repeatedly told the American diplomats that they intend to keep the Gazan economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge. Now, let's keep in mind that Gaza has always struggled for survival. And even when the Israelis left it in the early 2000s, they kept control of the area. So the Palestinian sovereignty simply wasn't there. Now, what the Israelis did was, I feel, extremely embarrassing, extremely disastrous in terms of history. They started calculating what would be an adequate number of kilocalories for the people to manage, but not to cause a famine. They concluded that, as we know, the survival baseline is about 2,100 kilocalories. The Israeli Red Line document used a higher calculation of 2,279 calories. But when you start these calculations, they really have a long and dark history in colonial settler societies. And two examples come to mind. Take the Great Southern Indian Famine in 1876. At the time, the British Famine Commissioner, Sir Richard Temple, also calculated these calories. And he felt that in order to maximize the revenues of the British Empire, he tried to find out what was the minimum amount of food for survival, which he projected up to 1,627 calories, kilocalories. Yet we know now in retrospect that there was an excess mortality that has been estimated at about 8 million people in British Empire of India at the time, pretty much as a result of this. This didn't stop these calculations in Israel, unfortunately. During the 2008 and 09 Gaza war, the Strip was subjected to a Shoah, which is the Hebrew term for Holocaust. According to the Deputy Defense Minister, Matan Wilnai, he acknowledged this at the time. Obviously, the objective was the same in 2009 as it has been in the past 2 years. From the Israeli point of view, which seems to be the case that the Americans, they had the American blessing to this, to overthrow Hamas. When President George Bush Jr. wanted to have these elections, democratic elections, I think the idea was that they should have been the right winner. Hamas did not represent the right winner, even though these were democratic elections to the West. Now, 2018, something new also happened. There was the UN Security Council resolution 2417, which was deliberately condemning the starving of civilians as a method of warfare. And this was passed. Nonetheless, we know that it has pretty much been insignificant in the past 2 years. My big question is, why is it that we are having this conversation now? Already when I was working on the fall of Israel, I thought that perhaps one way to look at the magnitude of this disaster is to look at it historically. And that means that we look at what happened in the British Empire, what happened also in the Nazi Germany's attempt to invade Soviet Union. It has many affinities, what we have seen in Gaza, with what happened to Leningrad at the time. There was an objective of the Nazi hunger plan by SS ideologue Herbert Backe, which had the objective to forcibly starve around 31 to 45 million Soviets and Eastern Europeans by capturing their food stocks and redirecting those food stocks to German troops, to German forces. These lessons, the Germans in the Nuremberg tribunal said, actually came from the US. The Nazi leaders said that we were simply emulating what American eugenics, white racism, and US treatment of Native Americans had done decades before. And there's an element of truth in this. So what does it mean when you then compare these numbers coldly? It means that the temple ration in Madras, about 1,700 calories, that probably was twice as much as what we've seen in the total food deliveries to Gaza since October 2023. Now, this does not mean all the areas in Gaza, but certain very difficult enclaves. And even the German concentration camps, what we saw in them, and Nazis kept track on this, records on this, in early 1940s, the numbers are not so different from what we've seen lately in northern Gaza. And there have been 3 waves of famine in northern Gaza. There was one right after the October 7 in the spring 24. That's when we saw the first victims, Palestinian victims of starvation. Their images were not so interesting to mainstream media at the time. God knows why. The second wave occurred towards the end of 24 and early 25. At the time, there was the so-called generals plan in Israel, where some generals got together and thought that what we can't do with the tanks, we can do with biowarfare. Epidemics will take care of the rest. That kind of calculation, I feel, should have nothing to do with the operations of the IDF. The long and short of it is that the daily intake of calories in Gaza has been terribly, terribly low for a longer time period, and this goes way back. Perhaps only in Warsaw Ghetto we have seen something even worse, but you can make the case in either way.
Well, that's very interesting that you pull up the comparison there to Nazi Germany. And obviously, this goes a little bit off of topic, but more to do with Israeli propaganda. One of the prominent arguments that we hear by Israeli propagandists is that, Palestinians are not dying in Gaza of starvation, they're dying of all sorts of other um, whether it be infections or it be pre-existing health conditions and all of the rest of this. And something that personally it struck me, their arguments seem to be very, very similar to the arguments that you hear, for instance, Nazi Holocaust deniers making. When it comes to, I've heard people say that nobody was starving in Auschwitz, for instance, and then they'll pull up a photo of somebody that was fat or overweight in Auschwitz. And we see the same sort of tactics here. Um, could you comment on the propaganda and the way that Israel and Israel's defenders are going about their propaganda and also address the point that we are seeing, of course, them trying to debate the fact that there's a famine, debate the United Nations declaration recently. And of course, as you mentioned, this has been going on for a very long time. We have keeping Gaza on a diet, which has been something historically referred to for the calorie count going into Gaza. For decades, that language has been used. And then obviously last year as well, Israel's top human rights organization, B'Tselem, issued its own report called Manufacturing Famine. Um, so, of course, I obviously said a lot there, but if you could comment on that and to the points of the propaganda that people are trying to push to deny what is happening in Gaza.
I think it's fair to ask that these numbers should be taken with caution. Calorie intake, what we know about it, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of historical records and there's a lot of contested numbers and so on and so forth. But I felt that these kinds of arguments really were increasing, particularly in the spring of 2024. There was a famous headline of the New York Post, "There's no famine in Gaza" at the time. And the realities were quite clear. But I don't think that you can hide the realities too long. The reality is that ultimately the real data will come out and then it will be debated. And I think that most Israelis, at least I hope, but I do think also most Israelis are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what they see when they can see something that happens in Gaza. They see the historical parallels. But the direct response to your question is this. I think that these kind of arguments, whatever their reasons, will backfire. And my concern is that when we deny the realities on any side whatsoever, when we deny the realities, then we are paving the way for something very dark. And ultimately, the truth will prevail. We will find out that information, but perhaps it is the case that those Israelis, particularly the Messianic far right, who are behind this, and Netanyahu cabinet that has chosen to keep them in the government, their intention is not so much the truth. Their intention is ethnic cleansing, taking over Gaza, just as West Bank, they're trying to incorporate that with the pre-1967 Israel. By then, it's going to be too late to argue about these things. And sometimes I wonder whether that is really the ultimate objective in all of this. Truth and the quest for truth certainly is not part of it.
And moving over slightly to a different topic, but somehow linked here. And of course, this has been something as well that's been in the headlines, and that links us to today and the sort of clash in Israeli society. And this is a topic that you touch on in The Fall of Israel. And you note that David Ben-Gurion had opted not to create an official constitution, highlighting the deep divisions between his camp and the revisionist Zionist camp. It's noted that this was done in order to avoid internal conflict at the time. However, in 2022, all of those years later, the religious Zionist camp under the command of Benjamin Netanyahu's new government ended up taking advantage of those loopholes left open for to reform and Judaize the country through judicial overhaul. or at least that is the narrative of the Israeli opposition, that Netanyahu's government is attempting to Judaize the Israeli regime. And so I would like to get your comment on that, because I think that's something very interesting, these sort of cracks inside of Israeli society, and what we're seeing happening right now. Because when we're talking about your book and the title of it, which is The Fall of Israel, I feel that this is one of those topics that not many people get into, but it is very, let's say, illuminating.
If I can make a personal comment, for me personally, and the reason I started writing this first book and then the second one very quickly, was that for me it has been a situation where Israel has been sleepwalking into a catastrophe. And Palestinians have been largely the victims of it. And the reason for this is the following. At the eve of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, I was touring in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights. I interviewed a lot of Israelis, Palestinians, both sides, let's say the colonizers and the colonized. And what I found so ominous at the time was the gap of perceptions between the two. The Israelis thought that, okay, now things are getting so much better, and gradually we can have the lasting peace, and it will be okay with the Palestinians, and perhaps there will be an end to an occupation, perhaps not. The Palestinians, on the other hand, saw no future and dreamed of a land of their own, as they had since the late 1940s, when they had been forcibly expelled. So this was an untenable status quo that compelled me to join the protest. At the time, I met Yael Dayan, the daughter of the famous General Moshe Dayan, who then became a peace activist, the first labor leader to meet with Yasser Arafat in early 1990s. I translated a book by Amos Oz, the famous author, who became the co-founder of the Israeli movement Peace Now. With all of these ideas at the time, I saw no alternative but to join the peace movement. And this is the reason why. I saw these settlements as a time bomb. And I was afraid that they could subvert Israeli democracy, endanger Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens and Palestinians, that it would then transform itself into apartheid and cause a cycle of forever wars with the Arab neighbors. And voila, 50 years later, this is exactly where we are. Right now, there are huge demonstrations in Israel for the hostages. Many of them want the end of the war. But nonetheless, the key issues have already been debated in Israeli Knesset, the parliament. When you look at this movement that you referred to, this movement from democracy towards autocracy, I think that one key benchmark was the history of the Jewish nation-state bill. This started already 2011. And it was launched, this idea, first time by Avi Dichter, who was a former director of Shin Bet, Israel Security, who himself had been charged with extrajudicial killings and human rights violations during the Second Intifada. He filed this nation bill and a proposal that would define the nature of the state of Israel as a state of Jewish people. And he was also one of the first ones after October the 7th who said that where we are now going to is Gaza Nakba 2023, the second Nakba. So it was this movement from a country that was supposed to be democratic and secular and then Jewish into something very different, not so democratic or autocratic, religious and far right by its methods that we saw. Now, you said rightly that B.G. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, considered to be his founding father, he was very careful with this idea. I think that he knew that there would be critics later on in Israel. Take Meron Benvenisti, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who said that if we do this, if we turn this state into a Jewish state, we will create Herrenvolk democracy, the kind of democracy you've had in South Africa, Rhodesia, and other countries which are clearly colonized that had apartheid rule, or segregationist US South in the past, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, this law was passed 2018. And I think that they forgot the wisdom of BG in the sense that he knew that this would be an extremely divisive issue. It would divide Israel. And he, as a strong man, wanted to consolidate Israel after 1949 at any cost, I personally feel. But he was smart as a pragmatic, hard politician in the sense that he avoided this term and allowed the Israeli de facto constitution to be created incrementally after he actually left office. So then we had a situation where the Supreme Court Judge Aaron Barak was influential in the creation of a series of laws that sort of functioned as a constitution in Israel. What Netanyahu cabinet wants to do from day one, after 1 decade of trying it outside the government, with the support of the far right, was to take this law and change the very nature of Israel from the democracy into an autocracy. And it also served his personal aims because he really wants to keep his government position, to remain the prime minister, to avoid prosecution for bribery that which trial started only in 2016, I believe. There are some other countries that do not have a constitution, including Saudi Arabia, UK, New Zealand, San Marino, Saudi Arabia, but Israel is not usually seen among these. So when Netanyahu cabinet comes in, they really started a counter-revolution with their so-called judicial reforms. And that meant that the politics and their politics would infiltrate the presumably independent judicial institutions. They have been trying to push it through the war, under the fog of war. And every time they tried, they failed until recently. Now they've been able to pass parts of it. And the fear, I think, in Israel, particularly the peace movement, but also among the centrists, is that these laws ultimately will be passed. And big reason for this, I think, is that the United States is not intervening with what happens in the so-called Gaza war, and the Europeans haven't moved ahead to start the greater boycotts, for instance. So unfortunately, that's the reality of Israel. The very nature of the country as a democracy is changing dramatically.
Another thing that, of course, is not exactly the same topic, but along the line of it, is that Benjamin Netanyahu himself has been accused of sort of surrounding himself with yes men and isolating those voices critical of him. If you look at, for instance, he has removed or forced out the likes of his defense minister, Gadi Eisenkot, Benny Gantz were removed from the emergency war cabinet that was formed, and that was done away with as well. He even came after the head of the Shin Bet, and it does look like he's creating almost like this elite pro-Netanyahu bubble at the very top, from which then he gets to make whatever decisions he likes. I don't know if that's a characterization of what we're seeing that you agree with, but I did want to get your thoughts on that, and where it seems to be going in terms of what the Israeli government is now looking like, and why you think that is as well.
I think that the direction taken by by the Netanyahu cabinet is very dangerous to Israel. It has already been lethal to Palestinians, but it's very dangerous to Israel. I don't think that the enemy, quote unquote, enemy of Israel is the Palestinians or Palestine. I think it is the difference that Palestinians could make in the overall scheme of whatever structure there might be is critical to Israel itself. There is an enemy that Israel has, and it is itself. It's far right that for a long, long time, decades ago, started flirting with ideas that we've seen in 1930s create so much devastation all over Europe, including xenophobia and this kind of far right violence. But it also pertains to Netanyahu. And I think you're right in your assessment to a great degree, in the sense that there's a similarity, there's a parallel between the rise of neoconservatives in the United States and the rise of Likud, or Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud in the late 1990s, which is very different still from Menahem Begin, one of his mentors. This right is harsher, is harder, and it starts from revisionist Zionism, which for a long, long time was considered to be sort of margins of the Israeli society until the late 70s, 1970s, early 80s. And I think that he is surrounding himself with yes men and yes women, which is very dangerous because it's one way to not to pay attention to realities as they are. The realities that he is creating and his cabinet is creating will hurt Israel for decades to come. And it has already hurt so much Palestinians that I consider what has happened in Gaza the major collapse of morality in the early 21st century. I don't think that there's a parallel. This is not about numbers of people being killed, but how they are killed and the indifference that allows it, and the arms transfers that continue, and the trade that continues with Israel under these circumstances. It's hard to see other parallels. But when you then try to understand why Netanyahu? How could this happen? I had the pleasure of meeting him in mid 80s in New York. He had then, I think he was then in Consul. I met him in New York City. He was very smooth, very fast, rather smart, had been trained in management consultancies in the US and so on and so forth. And he represented a new face in Israeli politics at the time, the American face. And let's face it, he was really a dual citizen. He had a dual citizenship, as many members of the right-wing Likud have even today. But the key person there is his father and grandfather, really, if you look at his background. And I think you do have to look that far. The grandfather, Natan Bileikovsky, who was always against labor Zionism, ideas of pacifism, working together in a binational state, like Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein. These were terrible ideas. They are absolutely non-aligned with what the Jewish idea is. God knows what that Jewish idea is. They also cooperated with the famous Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who is very much behind this combination of extreme nationalism with religious Judaism. These were ideas that didn't really work too well in Israel until after 1967. His idea was that the creation of Israel itself was a reincarnation of the old Jewish kingdom. 1967 war meant that we are getting closer to the end of times. And now these far-right religious zealots they really believe that when Gaza is destroyed, West Bank incorporated, we are moving to a new era, which will mean the end of the Temple Mount as we know it, the end of Al-Aqsa, the end of Omar Mosque, these beautiful Islamic historical legacies that make the city, give it a character, an imprint. But the other characters, when you look at Benjamin Netanyahu, you really have to look at Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of Revisionism, and his father, Ben Zion Netanyahu. Netanyahu was not the family name, it was the grandfather's pen name. So this idea of hard revisionist Zionism, where you create an iron wall against Israel's neighbors, that has been there from the start. His father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, who also cooperated with Abba Ahimeir, one of the most contested characters of the Jewish revisionist history, an assassin who flirted with fascism and wanted to have a tradition among the early right-wing Jews that they would welcome Zev Jabotinsky, that he would welcome Il Duce with the same sort of a greeting. There was, of course, Menachem Begin. He was the head of before being the head of Likud, he was the head of the Irgun group, the far-right terrorist group. And Yitzhak Shamir, his successor, another premier who was the head of the Stern group, still harder approach to politics, right-wing politics, and no negotiations whatsoever with the Arab countries, Palestinians, or even Arab minority in Israel, and so on and so forth. So this is the background where he comes from. But at the same time, I think we would be at loss if we would characterize this war, as people now do, Netanyahu's war. Sure, he has played an extraordinary role in that he's been managed to continue this war when he didn't really have a purpose in the first place, but it still continues. In that regard, he is a political fox. But now he opened the henhouse for other foxes that are far more lethal, like the far-right characters of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and a few others. So there is an entire cabinet now that's behind the difficult decisions. Only two have been charged by the National Criminal Court. Others could be, as I argue in the Obliteration Doctrine. And worst of all, when the United States has not intervened by halting the arms transfers, this continues. It's a curious situation. Israel presses the trigger, sorry, but Americans provide the weapons and the Europeans won't stop the trade. So you're rewarded for doing wrong. How could you end the war then?
Mhm. And that, I suppose, leads me to the question, the big question with your book, The Obliteration Doctrine. You talk about the Obliteration Doctrine as its historic connection to the scorched earth policy, and you go quite deep into that in history, and you look at how this strategy was previously weaponized. So I'd like to ask you, in the interest of time, obviously we've taken up a bit of your time today, and in respect of your time, my final question to you is, what is the Obliteration Doctrine for everybody listening?
Obviously, it's not something that came out of the blue. It has its origins, and briefly put, I think that there are four parts to it. There's a scorched earth policy. We have seen this from since ancient Greece, but not to this extent. And oftentimes in the history, it happened when the army that had been defeated started to flee, and they destroyed everything behind them. The Nazis did that, for instance, in the northern Finland. I'm a native of Finland, used to be there a long time. Now I've been a long time in the US and in Asia. But that was one example that you can have. The other example is collective retribution. Um, Personal liability doesn't matter. It's a collective that counts. So when there's a war, so this war against Gaza, against Hamas, the idea that every Palestinian that is in Gaza is guilty by default. And I think that this is a very, very dangerous idea. We see it in many totalitarian ideologies, even including the worst ones, fascism and Nazism, but still many others as well. And certainly in the kind of apartheid rule that one would wish never see in Israel, Palestine. And then there's a civilian victimization. The idea is that civilians are no longer just collateral damage. It is the objective to hurt civilians and civilian infrastructure. These are the principles that were already created in Dahia, Beirut, mainly Shia Muslim enclave of Beirut in the late 2000s. And when these ideas were then coined by Gadi Eisenkot at the time, one of the Israeli generals, I was shaking, 15, 20 years ago, because I had to ask myself, what happens when these things will happen? When, not if. There was a very clear idea among the Israeli military elite that this would be the next strategy in the next war. Yet there was no international intervention. There's a fourth aspect that characterizes obliteration doctrine, and that is massive, indiscriminate aerial bombing. And what's new about Gaza, for the first time in history that I know, artificial intelligence was an essential part of it. So you basically count on kill probabilities. It doesn't matter who dies. If it's civilians, all the better, then people will move faster if you're after ethnic cleansing. It is these four elements that I think are the most serious aspects of this kind of obliteration doctrine that we see. And what frightens me is the relative ease by which people talk about it. Even President Trump, after the attack against Iran, repeated the word obliteration so many times. And I couldn't help but think the pioneer of the Genocide Convention, Raphael Lemkin, who was so strongly for criminalizing genocide, preempting genocide, and treating it as a crime. And yet we see state leaders now perhaps being saturated with this kind of language and this kind of doctrines. So the fear is what happens next? I have felt from the beginning of this war, and I'm very uncomfortable with the term war. It should be reserved for situations where you have state actors like armies or non-state actors at least. But when up to 70% or more of people who are killed, maimed, injured are women and children, not to speak of the missing and not to speak of the indirect deaths that will inevitably happen in the next decades. This is not war. It's mass butchery by any other name, the way I feel about it. This is not a moral response. It's all a statement of fact. We should call these things as they are, and we should treat them as such, not by undermining the international law, but by respecting it, by working together for its realization. That, I think, is in the interest of everybody. So these four aspects, scorched earth policy, collective retribution, civilian victimization, and massive indiscriminate aerial bombing are the key. And let's keep in mind, when the Gaza war started, we heard continuously from mainstream media, these are targeted events, these are targeted bombing, and so forth. 2 months later, even the CIA had to conclude that no, that's not the case. 50, 70% of these bombs have been indiscriminate. So there's a purpose to this. It's not being done because those who give the order for bombing don't know what is going on. They know quite clearly what happens. It is the strategic way of using non-strategic means or war instruments, if you will.
And I think that's a horrifying wake-up call to understand it in that way and to break down what we're seeing in the Gaza Strip and how the genocide is being carried out in this way. And especially, I think what's powerful, especially in your book, is the way that you break this down and you do go into the history of where these different elements of the Obliteration Doctrine have been used before. I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for coming on, and we do hope to have you on here again. I want to urge all of our listeners to make sure that they do pick up both of the books. That's The Fall of Israel, The Degradation of Israel's Politics, Economy and Military, and The Obliteration Doctrine, which we just touched on there. These are very important reads. And we do hope to have you on again to discuss these issues further, hopefully under better circumstances. So thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you, Robert. It was my privilege, and I'd be glad to return. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the FloodGate Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and continue following the Palestine Chronicle for more.